Welcome to the lecture on Clinical Note-Taking Frameworks for the Counseling Therapist Diploma Program at Stenberg College. At the end of this session, you should be able to discuss best practices for the creation and maintenance of complete, clear, and accurate records. Session Overview: Clinical Note-Taking, the SOAP and DAP frameworks. So there's two particular types of ways to take notes, take clinical notes. When you first start, you might think, oh, what do you include? What do you leave out? What's important to capture? What's not that important? So there's people who have done a lot of work and figuring out of what the best things are to include in our notes. And there's two kind of different approaches. So we'll look at these as frameworks, and then there's some particular acronyms that we can use to remember whichever framework makes more sense to us. So framework 1 is where we're including particular things in our session notes. So major topics discussed, any immediacy issues, so those are concerns that are focused on the relationship between the client and counselor, any interventions or techniques that you used, what are your plans for further sessions, have you assigned any homework, which it would include any books that they need to read, and have you made any referrals? So this is one way of taking session notes, these categories and topics. Another framework when you're looking at note taking could look like this. So you're actually reviewing the last session. So you go through, what did you do? And because this is what you might actually do in session, right? You might actually start by reviewing the last session. So you could capture that in your notes. And then in the notes, you would talk about, what was the focus of the current session? What were the client's goals and homework, short and long range? And what are the counselor's observations or plans? So just a more bird's eye view approach to note taking. So these are the two different frameworks that we could work within. And we could even, combine them in some way if that makes sense to us as well. So there's a framework that's called the SOAP framework. And that one is subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. So let's work with each of these by letter. So subjective is the information that's reported by the client. So you want to include that. Objective are, now, is this really objective? It's a subjective experience of the counselor, could be argued, but for the purposes of this acronym, we're going to say objective, and this would be the results of the counselor's observations, tests, and other assessments that are administered. So the client tells you what's going on for them, and then O would be, okay, and what do you see, and what assessments have been done, and what do you see and notice as a counselor. As far as observations, so client came in disheveled, that would be an observation. Assessments, the counselor's impressions that are generated by the data. So, objective might be the client came in with looking disheveled, and then an assessment may be having difficulty getting motivated in hygiene, for example, right? And so when you put it all together, that's why they're looking disheveled. So there's a little bit of a difference between the objective piece and the assessment piece. So just be clear about that. Objective is more like a fact that anybody could see, and assessment is your perspective on what's happening. And then the plan. So what is the diagnosis and the treatment plan? You might not have a diagnosis per se, but what is the treatment plan, and then any modifications that may be made. So this might change. You might in the first session have a particular treatment plan, and then in the second or third session that treatment plan may start to evolve. So if you keep track of this, you can see how that changes as you go through the time together with your client. So a variation of the SOAP framework that's a little less structured, this is another way to look at note taking. So you might note down client's remarks, client's feelings, any interventions used, and then recommendations for homework, referrals, etc. So this is pretty much the SOAP framework, but softer, not as precise, but we're still capturing that basic data. Then there's a different kind of framework, different approach called the DAP framework, data, assessment, and plan. So data is an objective description of what occurred during the session. So what actually happened. Client talked about this. Um, what are the facts of what happened? Assessments is the counselor, again, the counselor's interpretations based on the data, of course, in the context of the presenting problem and the treatment plan. So, an example might be data could be something like client did not make eye contact during this session. Assessment may be something like having difficulty building rapport with client, seems to be withholding sharing personal information, right? That's an assessment. That's not data. That's not a fact. That's how you're interpreting what you see. And then the plan, what do you intend to accomplish in the next session or sessions? And ideally, those plans would be informed by the client, right? So if the client has come to you for a particular reason, like say they've come to you for, I don't know, reducing their anxiety, but in the process of therapy, you realize that they have a really dysfunctional relationship with their sister. Okay, your plan, the plan that you might want to make is let's work on the relationship with the sister. But that's not what your client asked you for. What your client asked you for was to help with their anxiety. Now, there may be a link, there may be a connection point, but it's important that whatever plans we mark down are plans that our clients have actually initiated, not things that we think are best. And if there are things that we think are best, like that's a conversation to have with the client, right? That's not, we can't have hidden agendas in counseling. So here's some best practices for clinical note taking. We want to indicate whether the notes were recorded during a session or after. So one of the ways of doing that is just having that right on your form, like in-session notes or post-session notes, so that you can be clear about that. If you use any shorthand in your notes, so say you use things like CBT or maybe there's a particular technique or visualization. I know, for example, I use a visualization called the Cave of the Heart meditation. So I might say CH meditation, and nobody's going to know what that means. So I actually have to have a code, like kind of a key to explain any of those codes. And one of the things I try to do is actually write things out as best as I can so that it's not confusing. There's certain things, like I said, CBT, some of these things that, are general knowledge of what they mean. Yes, you will have to have a code to explain what do those abbreviations mean. You can't actually use a code to try to obscure information, like, oh, nobody will know what this means, because you're going to be asked, if you're ever on the witness stand, you're going to be asked, like, what does CH mean? And you'll have to explain it, right? So that's not the purpose. Purpose is, some people like to, quickly take notes, and they use short forms or abbreviations. You might consider flagging or marking entries that might have legal significance. So if there are things that kind of are a flag for you, that, oh, this could be something important in a hearing or something like that, that maybe make a little mark or write LS or something like that to flag it, so that as you're looking back over those notes, what was written. You also want to develop a policy on whether you're going to document all phone calls and all email exchanges, right? So, where does that go? Does that belong in the notes? Does that belong somewhere else? Do you just not record that and you just leave that up to your telephone records? How do you do that? And that's practitioner to practitioner. So a few more best practices. We want to indicate when we've received information from a third party. So for example, a client's doctor may reach out to you with information or to ask information. You want to put that in. It's possible that a family member might check in or call. I always record those as well. If there's been a communication from somebody who's not my client about my client, I put that in the notes. If we're writing notes with pen and paper, it's really important to avoid using whiteout or an eraser. Better to cross out the words and make a new entry. And the purpose for that is, again, like you're not trying to hide anything, and you want to show, like, oh, this is what I meant to say. And so when I know that there's some note-taking software out there where you actually have to do the note, and if you make any changes after you've kind of closed that note, it comes in as an amendment to that note. So you want to initial, sign, and date any corrections that you make with pen and paper note-taking. And if you have particular opinions, right, clinical impressions, then you want to label them as such. Like, Something might be, client came in very tired, and stressed. Right now, that's an opinion that I'm basing. I'm making that opinion based on certain things that I see in my client, but maybe they didn't necessarily tell me that they were tired or stressed. I just assume that. So that would be a clinical impression. Now, that's different from speculations. So a speculation might be something like client had a very difficult night, which is why she was tired and stressed, why she came in tired and stressed. Now, the client never told me any of this. I'm just making that up. I'm just putting those together. That's actually not something to be recorded in the notes because that's not actually fact, right? That's my assumptions or things that I'm putting together. It might be true and it might be useful for me for counseling, but it's not needed. Those kinds of things don't need to be recorded in the notes. We also want to make sure we're recording all the methods of treatment that are used. Now, throughout this program, you will have opportunities to practice note-taking and work with your instructors and your practicum supervisors on note-taking. So you will get a chance to practice this, but for now, it's good to just understand the theory and the purpose of clinical note-taking. So in summary, it's important to familiarize yourself with some of the clinical note-taking frameworks just so that you have that foundation as you're taking your notes. And you want to make sure that you follow those best practices for note-taking and storage of the client's records.